right now. We believe that if we continue without raising the consumption tax, in the close future, Japan will run out of government revenue, resulting in not being able to sufficiently provide social welfare to its citizens. We think this is problematic, and every single time a politician tries to run an election and gain votes for raising consumption tax, it doesn't get elected. We think this is problematic because the problem is urgent, and therefore we believe that the consensus is not necessary, and we can mandate the increase of consumption tax. I'm going to talk about three things in my speech. First of all, I'm going to talk about why now. Second of all, I'm going to talk about the justification of why we do not need a consensus. And third of all, I'm going to talk about the benefits from this proposal. But before moving into my points, let me clarify our model. So obviously we're going to do this in Japan, and we're going to raise the consumption tax from 5% to 15%, and we're going to implement it as soon as possible. Having that clarified, let me move into my points. Why now? In the status quo, Japan is in a great debt, right? Because of various reasons. Obviously, there's a global recession, meaning that a lot of industries are not doing as well as before. And second of all, because the increase of population, we have smaller labor force, right? We think that is why there's less and less tax coming into government revenue. We think under the status quo, the government revenue is low, right? Because there is no possibility of economy going to grow in this recession when we see it continuously. To prove it, every single year, Japan has never been making any benefits, and the debt is increasing every single year, right? We're going to run out of money if we continue this, because there's no solution other than tax raise. And no, thank you. They're not going to be able to raise government revenue in any other way, for example, to borrow money, right, from outside. We believe that the only reason credit rating companies rate Japan's credits not so low is number one, because we can't trust them, right? Greece didn't rate them low until it happened after. They're merely private companies, they're not the nation. And we think number two, because they believe that different from EU, they still have a space to raise tax because EU already has 60 or 40%. And because politicians continue to vote for this raise of consumption, they finally believe in the raise, right? That is the only reason why they continue to rate it in a good way, right? We believe this is very, very problematic. That government revenue is running low, right? Because only by government revenue can you provide social welfare to its citizens. By saying social welfare, we mean education, we mean building roads, building hospitals, providing Medicare so every single person who gets sick can go to hospitals, buy medicine, receive surgery, etc., right? So every single citizen can support its children. All of these supports are absolutely necessary, because without health, you're not going to be able to live, right? Without education, you're not going to be able to make choices to recognize your future, right? Without roads, there's probably going to be no industry, because you're not going to be able to send and import stuff, etc. We think every single policy which is made and consisted of the government revenue is fundamental for the human rights of Japanese citizens, and we think it is very problematic that in the near future we will not be able to provide these things. No, thank you. Because there's no possibility of growth, that is exactly the reason why we have to do it now. Number two, no, thank you. Why we do not need consensus. Number one, because the matter is urgent, as I have already told you, right? There's no possibility of Japanese economy to grow under the status quo, and the matter is severe, right? The consequences are severe. People are not going to be able to be protected of their human rights sufficiently. We think that is a very, very big problem. But number two, we think we don't need consensus, because these matters of budgets, it's very difficult for citizens to understand, right? It's very difficult for an ordinary citizen to distinguish between how many billion is okay for a debt and how many billion is not okay for a debt, right? So even if we are told throughout the news that we have this great big billion of debt, we think it's very difficult for citizens to calculate if that is fine and we can sustain the economy for years, right? We think that citizens are rather short-sighted because, no thank you, they can clearly see the impact of raising consumption tax. If we say that we raise consumption tax, the first thing they're going to think about is the food is going to get more expensive, the clothes they're going to buy is going to get more expensive, right? They can calculate about today or tomorrow, and they tend to prioritize that because the harms they can see from that is much clearer from the harms they cannot clearly assume which would happen a year later or 2 years later, right? We believe that citizens are short-sighted, and because budget is a very difficult issue, we think we cannot trust the citizens to mandate or to vote for these things. That is exactly why politicians who run for the raise of consumption tax continuously don't get elected, uniquely in Japan, where we have kind of been okay for the past years, right? We think that's not going to continue. Third of all, it is the justification because it affects everybody. From government budget, everybody relies on this. Everybody has a chance to get sick. Everybody has a chance to use those roads. Everybody is going to need those educations. And because everybody has a possibility to benefit from these government revenues, we can oblige every single person to contribute this way into society, right? No, thank you. Example, Fukushima. When Fukushima happened, it was number one, an urgent issue because it's related to life, right? Number two, people were not able to understand the impact of these things, no thank you, from nuclear plants, etc. So that is why and number three, because it affects everybody, right? If everybody has an effect, a possibility to get affected by these things, no thank you. That is why the government went on a paternalistic policy and protected every single person. Without the consent of anybody, we were able to shut every single person out of the most dangerous places in Fukushima. We think it's the same thing. Number three, the benefits. Number one, we think everybody is going to pay it, the 15%, because every single person needs daily commodities, right? They're not going to be able to ignore the fact that they need to buy food, that they need to buy clothes, etc. So we think everybody is going to go buy it. Number two, not everybody can leave the country, right? We think a lot of people are attached to their land and they will not move out of the country. That is why they would be buying products in Japan. Secondly, they're going to be able to pay it. Number one, clearly the rich people have no problem, right? They have a lot of money to buy food. It's probably no harm at all, right? Middle class is relatively okay in Japan because they have a stable job and we think it's not much of a burden. Number three, even the poor people will be able to buy it because we're going to have clear benefits from the rich people and the middle class people. And even if the government has to subsidize a relative amount of people, we think we have enough money to subsidize those people because we're going to be able to collect a vast amount of money from every single citizen. What happens then is that in the future we will not be devastated from providing enough social welfare, and for all those reasons we are very proud to propose this.
That this debate is not about whether this increase of the consumption tax is going to benefit for these countries such as Japan that they're illustrating. We believe that this debate comes down whether actually going to the public opinion with a majority consensus are still opposing to the fact that the Democrats are going to actually increase the taxation, right? We believe that kind of analysis is morally wrong because that simply goes against the concept of democracy. We believe that this proposal is only going to bring about this breakdown, the destroyal of the democracy, and we believe there's going to be a conceptual and both practical harm that it coexist by taking their model, and thereby we oppose. Now, we don't think, as an opposition, we don't think that this proposal should not be taken under now, because we believe, as an opposition, increase of the consumption tax itself are okay. But the thing is, it is not the time yet, because the consensus of the majority are still opposing to the fact of the manifesto, which the Democrats had actually proposed in the past general elections. Now, I'm going to rebut to the Prime Minister. Alright, she has talked about, right? There's no way, there's no any other way to collect this governmental revenue. The stagnated economy is severe, and thereby they have to take this proposal, right? We don't think this is the case, because they've already acknowledged the fact the rating of the bond of the national bond of Japan is relatively higher rank, right? So there's still room for them to actually sell the bond to the investors abroad, and they can actually collect the money from the investors. Or maybe they can decrease the number of salary which are paid to the public servant, right? Or they can itself cut down the aggregate number of the public servant within Japan, and that actually that actually increases the budget which the Japanese government can actually afford by not taking this proposal. So we believe there is much more way to go than actually having this radical proposal that the affirmative side is actually given up in today's model. Now, second, she has talked about how consensus itself is unnecessary because citizens do not understand how much budget. But the question is whether the government knows, right? What exactly is the extent of whether the debt is actually excessively higher or not that excessively higher, or maybe it's okay or it's not that okay, right? We don't think there's any clear distinguishment of the government can say to the citizens don't know the consequence, so thereby they can have this dictator, like anarchy kind of like style of this politics within Japan. This is completely unjustifiable. Alright, we have 3 points to talk about. Firstly, I'm going to talk about how increasing consumption tax now is unjust. Second, I'm also going to talk about how increase of the consumption in Japan especially is unjust. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about the practical consequences by taking this proposal. Now, firstly, how increasing consumption tax itself is unjust. Mr. Speaker, we believe that the majority is going against, or at least not accepting to the fact that Democrats are going to actually raise the consumption tax. Because we believe democracy in the first place is essentially necessary when we're talking about countries Japan. Because democracy works when the citizens' will are being represented. We're not giving any kind of power, right? We're not giving the power to manipulate these policies or control. Citizens ask or citizens claim, like simple problem or small problem, ethical problem, or is poverty, right? Those things are being claimed to these specific kinds of people, which is the politician, and they have an obligation to answer back. We're not giving any kind of power for them to actually make this dictator kind of style of the politics. And also we believe that why this democratic process of the consensus meeting itself is essentially important. Well, I know it kind of takes some time to actually reach to the majority vote, right? But we don't think that this is not unnecessary, because by through these democratic processes, then the citizens are going to be more responsible, because all these policies or all these decisions which the citizens had made are going to be directly coming back to themselves, right? And thereby this creates this active participation, for example, in the voting itself, Mr. Speaker. And thereby citizens are going to represent whatever things that they are having as a problem, maybe poverty or ethical problem or any other kind of problem that they are having under the status quo. And that creates the most healthy decision, and that creates the most healthy policy by the politics, right? So if we take their proposal, we believe things like America are going to happen. Because in the past election, Obama won the election with the presidency, right? Obama claimed when he actually became the president that I'm going to bring about this national healthcare system. That means more and more poor people assume that they're going to be safe, because the national healthcare insurance are going to be applicable for these people. But the consequence was Obama, president itself, are becoming hesitant. They haven't implemented this policy yet. That created a lot of the rise or backlash for the citizens. That created a decrease in the trust to the politics itself, Mr. Speaker. We believe the same sort of things are likely to happen by taking their model. Now, the main point: how increased consumption tax, especially in Japan, is unjust. Mr. Speaker, if you think about the social politics of Japan under the status quo, in the past general election, there were two parties, right, that was hitting each other. One party was the Liberal Democratic Party, and the other is the Democrat Party. The Liberal Democratic Party had actually claimed that we are going to raise consumption tax. On the other hand, these Democrats claim we are going to not raise the consumption tax. That was a huge debate, and that was a huge criterion for these citizens to actually make any kind of decision. Because increase of the tax itself is going to affect every individual, right? Because economy, or this consumption tax actually occupies every single action that you are going to make. Even if you go to stores, or even if you go to convenience stores, or any other service that you are going to get from these markets, you have to pay a certain amount of money. The increase of the taxation, people thought that this is going to be harmful, and thereby they chose Democrats, right? But the consequence is that the government, right, even they are saying we're not going to raise tax, and the citizens said that, and citizens also conceded to the fact. But the reality is that if you open up the door, then the Democrats are actually raising taxation, right? So we believe this is completely unjustifiable, because this actually betrays citizens' will. We believe this actually breaks and destroys the concept of the democracy. Now, why if this is harmful, right? This is going to be my third point. Why the practical consequences by actually destroying the concept of the democracy? Mr. Speaker, we believe there are going to be two scenarios that is going to happen. Whether this increase of the taxation maybe work, right? As they have admitted. Well, if that's the case, the citizens are going to say, well then, we don't, you guys don't need it anymore. Because you guys are the ones who are taking any kind of action without responding or asking what we want you guys to do, right? And thereby, people are becoming hesitant. And thereby, we believe the public discourse, which should be undertaken through media or through this community about ethical problem or any other problem that citizens are having, are not going to be reflected to these government when they're making any other kind of policy in the future, Mr. Speaker. We believe this is going to detriment the citizens' quality of life. And second, what if this consumption tax is going to fail? A major assumption, well, since this debate is not about whether this consumption tax raising itself is going to work or not, but like we didn't hear any of these consumption tax is going to work or not, because they never hear, right, from the citizens how to allocate these like money, right, like welfare or these like budget or like I don't know, like public other like enterprises. We don't think that this is just too vague. If that fails, we believe the active participation itself is going to detriment because they don't care anymore, right? We believe the loss of the trust from the citizens itself is completely unacceptable, and thereby we're very much glad to close. Thank you.
Opposition side. So they misunderstood and they undervalued the reality of the sovereign debt crisis in Japan, Mr. Speaker. But more importantly, like when they agree that the raise of consumption tax is self-necessary, and without analyzing any engagement towards the problem that the government has provided you, is just selfish reasons. But more importantly, what they tell you from side affirmative is that this is necessary situation that we need to take. It is not because there are many cases the government mandate certain laws towards people, Mr. Speaker. As our first speaker already tell you, like the instances of these kind of situations, for instance, 3/11 earthquakes. In these kind of urgent situation, we think the government is most trusted as the making the rational and most beneficial decision for the citizens, and for that reason, we need to pursue this policy. I'm going to talk about two things today in today's debate. Firstly, I'm going to talk about why this makes stable government a stable country, and secondly, I'm going to talk about why this would stabilize Japan as international members. But before that, 3 points of rebuttal. Firstly, they talk about the democracy is fundamentally important, and they always, when the government make a decision, like citizens' will should be represented. We think that is good, but more importantly, the fundamental premise that this kind of will is represented is not just because they vote for this person, but the things that the citizens want will be, but actually pursued by these politicians, which is to recognize the deep necessity of the citizens by these people who are trusted, who are elected by these citizens in the first place, Mr. Speaker. And when the urgent situation comes up, or the unexpected situation comes up, people always trust the government, trust the politicians who they elected, even if the problem wasn't raised before the election, Mr. Speaker. And we think in many cases, like the government pursues these sort of policies, right? But secondly, they talked about what was it? Oh, they lied to the politician or that sort of stuff. Mr. Speaker, that is just not true, Mr. Speaker. That is not true. Why? Because there are many cases, like they don't just vote for politicians just because that certain things exist in that kind of thing. They exist in that manifesto. But more importantly, they compare so many things that these liberal Democrats or Democrats have, and they don't decide on one thing that they have divisively have. And therefore, we think even if they fail to recognize one claim within the manifesto, we think the government has right to do what they pursue for what they believe in. No, thank you. Thirdly, they talked about they lose the credibility after taking this model. We think that is false, because if we take the negligent approach of keeping the status quo, the sovereign debt of the Japan will decrease by. We have already twice as much of the year budget, and that will we are always every year we are making deficit, Mr. Speaker, from the budget, and we think that will lead to ultimately the corruption of the government, corruption of the economy, because the country cannot or no longer pay the debt that they have owed for the international community. And therefore, if the country itself corrupts, that's when you lose the trust, Mr. Speaker. For instance, Greece or Poland or that kind of countries, Mr. Speaker. So their case just false.
Sir.
So, yes.
So in 311, every person agrees we have to take action. On the other hand, consumption tax, some scientists or some economists against these kinds of raising the consumption tax. Why these kinds of controversial issue is an urgent issue, and why can take this proposal?
Because it actively benefits the country itself, Mr. Speaker. Because the extent of controversial itself is bad. Like this, so like if they say like there are so strong discourse about like these kind of things, like the only reason, for instance, the international community is saying, for instance, we've already given you the example of, for instance, Standard Poor's. The only reason that these companies are rating these sovereign debt rates of the Japan so high is because there is room to fix this problem, and that only reason that they can fix the problem is raising the consumption tax, Mr. Speaker. And we think like because, for instance, other countries cannot have been like these making these decisions, and this Japanese citizens inactively acting upon it, and because as my partner already told you, these people are because like when we have referendum, for instance, because citizens will always oppose it, and because that will effectively harm these people's short-term benefit in their living, and therefore make the decision. And in that urgent situation, and more importantly, when there's active benefit that we can get, for instance, they cannot oppose to the increase in revenue itself, right? And therefore, when we are absolutely lacking the budget itself, we think this policy can be justified. So let's move on to my started. Firstly, why this actually makes a better situation for the government in Japan. So my partner already told you, like this will work, and this will increase the budget of Japan itself, right? Because 15% of raise of consumption tax money is a lot of money for the revenue, right? And therefore, like after taking this model, the government doesn't have to increase the, for instance, sovereign debt or deficit to continue the, for instance, help or social support for the citizens, Mr. Speaker. For me, more importantly, like at least by taking this model, the government won't increase or pass the debt to actually radically gain more revenues, because that necessity in the status quo will be covered by this policy. So, secondly, why this actually stabilize the international community, international position of Japan? So we think, like in the status quo, Japan is seen as economically unstable or politically unstable because the Japanese government is seen as not making the right decision when they face certain urgent sort of situations or circumstances, Mr. Speaker. When Euro crisis occurred, every government, taken for instance Britain, France, Italy, increased their consumption tax to tackle this issue. But and only Japan didn't tackle this issue by making the social, passing certain laws to help this. And therefore, when this actually benefits the whole country, we think this proposal should be taken.
There are people or economists who claim that this is not now to take increase in consumption tax. Their citizens know about their situation, where constantly depression of the economy hurts themselves, and they know if we take this proposal now, they might be get hurted. Bank gonna be bankrupted, or market will be shrinked after taking this proposal. Today's government sides are constantly talking about they are stupid, ladies and gentlemen, and they think they are the only actor who can decide what is absolutely good, Mr. Speaker. But we don't think it's way to go as a liberal democracy, Mr. Speaker. Why citizens can't decide about what they do, Mr. Speaker? Because citizens know about their situations, but government cannot know about it, Mr. Speaker. In which case, why we can actually ignore those kind of majority consensus, but taking technocrats, anti-democratic concepts, Mr. Speaker. We don't think it stands in Japan. It shouldn't be stands in Japan. So I will talk two things in my speech. Firstly, about the analysis of the people. Why people are opposing those kind of ideas of increasing the consumption tax? Do they know best about it? Secondly, I'm going to talk about why active discussion and participation of the citizens are needed and necessary and important and should be in a liberal democracy. First, firstly, rebuttals. Yuki told you about we made Japan's stable economy. That's why it's good. They think so, Mr. Speaker. But there are people who don't think so. That's why we can't take majority consensus right now, Mr. Speaker. There are people who think we cannot stabilize economy by taking this proposal. That's why we shouldn't, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to talk about it in my second analysis. Okay, let's move on to the second analysis. Why citizens opposing this idea? Why are the kinds of the citizens opposing the idea of the increasing consumption tax? Mr. Speaker, my honorable partner talked about how the democracy consists of. What kind of idea consists of democracy, Mr. Speaker? We think citizens know best about it, Mr. Speaker. Citizens know about what situation they are, and citizens are best actor for to choose what they need to be in taking a policy or plan, Mr. Speaker. In terms of this situation, Mr. Speaker, what is happening right now in those kind of economy in Japan, Madam Speaker, ladies and gentlemen? There is a constant depression happens to Japan, Mr. Speaker. And we are not saying those kind of increasing consumptions always bad. And they are not saying always good. Because we think consumption tax itself is an arbitrary idea. It cannot actually extend, we cannot expect what will happen after taking this proposal. So there is a people who think this will be more, but if we take this proposal, the situation will be more harsher. Because there is an actor who know because there is a depression. That's why if we take this proposal, because we increase the consumption tax, that's why, which means people will hesitate to consume. Because because consumption tax raising means price of the products will be raised. And if you want to consume something, you will be cost more. That's why people hesitate to consume. What will happen after all? Because of the market cannot sell, because people don't hesitate to buy. That's why market cannot sell well and benefits goes down. Therefore, they cannot invest their own development of the products. Then market will shrink, and shrink. If you see the example of the tobacco tax, in 1990s, there is a tobacco tax increased. That's why tobacco markets are shrink, Madam Speaker. If we take this proposal, we can expand this shrink of the market to the domestic situation. It might be happen. We are not saying absolutely it will happen. But there is a people who know it will be happen. Because of that, right now, uniquely, depression occurs to the Japanese economy. That's why this multiplication effect of those kind of depression and increasing consumption tax might hurt ourselves. And therefore, company tax or another income tax will be also decrease, and whole gross tax income will be decreased. Therefore, that's wrong. We are not saying it is absolute idea, but there is a people who think it is right and who know best about it. Because they are actually working for the company, they know constantly facing about those kind of depression, Mr. Speaker. That's why they should voice up to those kind of the government, Mr. Speaker. That's why they should claim their right to actually take their decision to the democracy, Mr. Speaker. We don't think that's the way to go. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why liberal democracy needs activity, active discussion and participation of the citizens. Mr. Speaker, my partner already talked about how this will disincentivize to actually trust government. Because what they are doing is all breaking their manifesto and actually taking this proposal. People will think manifesto doesn't mean nothing if politicians said something, but it will be conversed after all if they think it's absolute, Madam Speaker. That's why people will not actively participate to the politicians. Why it's problematic? Because in liberal democracies, ladies and gentlemen, each citizen should be a supervisor of your society, Madam Speaker. Each citizen should participate to the state activity, Mr. Speaker. Let's say in the case of the female discrimination in the 1980s in the United States, why actually we can solve this calm down this discrimination? It's because people, citizens, trust the government and people actively engage to expunge this discrimination. All people voice up to actually why we have to discriminate the female people, but we should encourage to voice up for the female people, Madam Speaker, ladies and gentlemen. That's why we need active discussion and participation of the citizens. Because after all, they will not trust government. They will not say, oh, they think they problem, but we don't actively participate to do that. Because they are not our representation. but they are representing themselves, Madam Speaker. That's why they need to actually represent our idea and reflect majority consensus, Madam Speaker. Don't lock them up in a castle of dictatorship, but please let them voice up. That's why we beg the vote.
So, ladies and gentlemen, LO are actually saying this debate is not about the practical consequences. However, the thing is that what they are actually saying was all the practical harm, isn't it? We believe that those people, we believe that those debts that is surrounding the Japanese government is universally bad, isn't it? We believe that those solution towards that problem has never been proposed by the opposition side. We believe that bomb is never be the solution, I will explain later on. We believe the consensus of the democracy is not so absolute, Mr. Speaker, so we are proud to propose that. So 3 things to talk this debate. Firstly, as consensus is so important on the taxation policy. And secondly, I'll deal with the problem. And thirdly, I'm going to explain how this proposal will affect the future governance. So what the DOL will say is deal with the third clash. So let's go to the first issue. Is consensus so important? Well, we have been telling you that consensus is not so necessary, especially for the taxation policy, the consumption tax raising, for some reason. They actually didn't rebut us how this is structurally impossible to raise consumption tax, even though it's absolutely required. They actually say that the consensus is so important. The first reason that it came from the government opposition is it is because it is democracy. Well, we believe in because it is democracy. Democracy is consensus, is everything is so important. We believe that what they're saying by democracy is just an ideal word. We don't think so, for several reasons. No thanks. First response is that they actually didn't engage at all, for example, the why Fukushima people have to be deprived of rights to live in the street after this later on. There was a time the government Monday, the restriction area from the 20 kilometers from the Fukushima first nuclear power plant toward 30 kilometers. And the majority of people are actually opposing to that policy. However, the thing is, the government successfully restricted those areas so that people cannot be exposed by the radiation system. But secondly, we believe his democracy system is not so realistic, right? So we believe the citizen, that reason of that is the citizen or both some politician because they want to make a realized manifesto, but because more than that we believe that those people actually trust the politician's credibility and they voted, right? So we believe in the realistic thinking, it is just for politicians to change the situation or to change the manifesto according to the changing situation. In that sense, those changing situation is obviously the debt and the economic crisis that is surrounding Japan right now. So we believe in that sense, people are voting some politician, which means that people are acknowledging the fact they could change and they could apply the situation with a specific demand on each period of time. So we believe this is not true. But second reason why they're thinking it is so important, is that they're not unique. It is not different at all with other kind of policy making. Right? So we have been able to tell you how it is uniquely different and important of this taxation policy is. First is to distinguish is the urgency, right? So we believe that this is urgent problem, so we can do it. We can do it as a Fukushima people have to be deprived of life for the life to place. But secondly, distinction it is different in the sense that the policy has passive effect on the citizen. Meaning that those people have to deprive their own life or own choice or etc. etc. We believe in that sense when the people have passive effect by some policy, people cannot choose a rational decision and bad decision. That's why the government mandating is important. For example, those people are actually opposing the when the Japanese government actually mandate the new security treaty with America. They didn't understand without acknowledging how this new treaty is important, because they are irrationally opposed it. Because those people actually have to be deprived and passive effect on this policy. So we believe in that sense it is different as well. But thirdly, and most importantly, difference is that those possibility on this effect, right? So we believe it is 100% sure that if we take and if we keep this consumption tax rate, with those Japanese government and its economy will be deficit. So in that sense, when this thing is controversial, it is required that those discussion between the policy or divided into affirmative and negative, the healthy discussion is needed, because of those consequences is so vague, and those choices and the consequences is so different. However, the thing is, we believe that in that case of debt, we believe it's 100% sure if we not take action, it is theory to debt. So we believe this is not the problem at all. So let's go to the second issue about the problem. If we call that yes.
Alright, people trust these coalition on the basis of the manifesto, right? How can you betray these citizens, and on what basis now, by taking your model, citizens can trust when this increase of the consumption tax itself is firstly bizarre?
So firstly, we think that those consensus is not the 100% sure, Mr. Speaker. So we believe in that sense it's a completely ridiculous argument. But secondly, let's go to the problem about it. They say that the problem has no solution. This is not a problem at all. The status quo is enough by increasing the population, increasing the amount of bomb, right? So we believe this is never a solution. It is ridiculous for them to solve the debt problem because of with a solution of debt. So, but secondly, we think it is impossible for the government to actually pursue the bomb solution eternally. So we believe that in the case of Greece, or we believe it is impossible when the Japanese or when the other country recognizes that those credibility is so low. We believe in that sense, we believe that this is completely not eternal. So let's get into the third issue about how this proposal will affect the future governance. There's three consequences that is coming from the opposition side. Firstly, they mentioned that the democracy is collapsed because of no cooperation of others in the some policy or other decision making. Firstly, it is not true, because those politicians, those citizens are vast majority cases are multi-dimensional, which means that those people are actually opposing the taxation policy, but still dependent on the government, like social welfare, etc., etc. So we believe this is possible for the citizen to actually completely oppose the government. So in that sense, cooperation still good. But secondly, we think the market shilling is not obviously happening at all, because what is the effectiveness of consumption tax raising is that every product is actually taxed and money, right? So in that sense, those taxation policy will surely work to increase and collect the money resources. So for those reasons, we are very proud of it.
Who knows best about yourself? Of course, you. Because you know about your lifestyle, you know about your job, and you know about your children, Mr. Speaker. In these kinds of contexts, what the government side said is, government, no. Why? Because we live in a liberal democratic society, under the democracy, we have to respect the citizens' voice and citizens' will, because we share assumption. Citizens know best, but they totally neglect these kinds of things, and they just destroy the principles of the democracy, Mr. Speaker. And we are very proud to oppose this motion. I have three issues to talk about. Firstly, who knows the best, citizens or government? And secondly, is it the emergency case and the increasing the consumption tax is absolutely good or not? And thirdly, about what is the practical consequence coming from this proposal? Firstly, about who knows the best. The government side poor analysis is, because citizens don't know about the budget, we cannot trust citizens. Why? Because the citizen can't know how many debt exists under the status quo, and citizens can calculate how their lifestyle is so bad or how their lifestyle is good. And if they calculate it, and if they think the increasing the consumption tax is necessary, they support these kinds of things. But by neglecting explain to citizens and just asserting consumption tax is increasing the consumption tax is necessary, it's totally unjust, because the government is also maybe don't know about what is the best or what is the bad. No, thank you. And secondly, about is it an emergency or is it absolutely increasing the consumption tax is okay or not? Only example coming from the government side is Fukushima. There's a radiation. The government forcing them to live there. What simple question? No one in this society agree with live in Chernobyl is a very good thing so forth. Everyone agree the radiation kills you. Maybe some crazy person, 1 or 2% maybe said it is okay, but majority person say radiation is bad. So therefore, the government forcing them to do such kind of things, and it is an emergency case. On the other hand, what the government side said is somehow in near future, maybe the government cannot sustain budget or so forth. When and why they just asserting these kinds of things. And important things is there is a majority citizen agree with the anti-increasing the consumption tax party. It means that people see the both side argument and people think the anti-increasing the consumption tax bill is right. So therefore, the tax observer clearly explained to you there is a many scenario can be considered, and maybe their scenario can be right, and maybe our scenario can be right. In this kind of situation, who should decide which is the right? And answer is citizen, Mr. Speaker, because the citizens knows about your future, about your current situation, about your salary or so forth. They totally neglect and just asserting government is special. Again, thirdly, about the election, because the government side assert we are not seeing the manifesto and we are just choosing the politician itself. Simple question: why they disclosing the manifesto at the first place? Because by showing the manifesto, the politicians show you how you are and who you are and how you sorry who you are and how you manage your government. And by seeing these kinds of manifesto, citizens say, okay, please do it, please do such kinds of things. Because, Mr. Speaker, without seeing the manifesto, we cannot say maybe he's a good person, maybe he's a bad person or so. How you decide? By seeing the manifesto. So therefore we say, if you change the manifesto, it means that citizens cannot choose, citizens cannot know who you are and how you are, who you are and how you manage the government or so forth, Mr. Speaker. Because the only way the citizens decide which is better and which is bad is manifesto, Mr. Speaker. Maybe some silly person choosing the, okay, forget about it. Anyway. So therefore we say, in these kinds of scenario, the citizens should know, should choose these kinds of things, and the politician should not betray these kinds of citizens, Mr. Speaker. Because that is why manifesto is the only reason why they voted for these kinds of citizens, these kinds of politicians, Mr. Speaker. Finally, I want to engage with the economic crisis again. So, sorry. Only the logic coming from the government side is universally it is bad. Because some grade company decreased the grade, and it is now. But please imagine, the Japanese government have AA standard, but AA rank, without having the strong military as same as the United States of America or so forth. So it means just degrade one rank is not so huge. Some person said these kinds of things, and some person said that because Japanese government lent more money to other country, if the situation is emergency, we can collect from other country or so forth. There is many people saying these kinds of things, and in this kind of situation, citizens trust these kinds of things. So therefore we say they cannot prove absolutely under the status quo the situation is emergency. So therefore we took this back. Finally, about what is the practical consequence happens after taking proposal. Because firstly, we show you maybe bad scenario is against or so forth. So therefore, we cannot decide which is the best. But the thing is, the only harm we present you about the trust for the trust of the citizen, trust of the politician. They never ever engage about these kinds of things. Because, Mr. Speaker, the Democrat Party said we Speaker. So therefore, such kind of harm we present you is occur, but they never engage. Anyway, citizens should choose. Thank you.
Sweeping generalization coming from the affirmative side in this debate is that citizens aren't the best actor to decide what kind of choices that the government should be taking as a policy in terms of democratic politics, right? Because they concern that citizens cannot actually calculate whether what kind of amount or the aggregate number of the debt itself is essentially important. We believe that consumption tax, which takes this debate, is that can be connected to the everyday life of the citizens, right? We've been telling you in the first place whether this increase of the consumption tax is going to be economically beneficial or not. That's the crucial failure that the government side had to actually respond to that. We believe, but moreover, we believe that it actually detriments the concept of democracy in the first place by betraying, because now the citizens cannot trust these politicians. We believe this is actually going to the counterproductivity in terms of democracy as a whole, and thereby we're still proud to oppose. Now, two things to sum up this debate. First, I'm going to analyze what exactly is the democracy that takes place in Japan now. Second, I'm going to also talk about whether people would be satisfied, because the simple assumption of the government side is that the raising of the consumption tax itself is absolutely going to work. And I'm going to tell you in both scenarios that it's not the case. Now, moving on one by one. Let's see, what exactly is a democracy? Mr. Speaker, we believe the assertion from the government side today is that democracy is absolute, because government itself is absolute, because citizens, like these politicians, like the analysis coming from finally, from the whip speaker from the government side, is that citizens trust these politicians, right? But the basic question that I have asked for the point of information, and it's consistent stance from the entire opposition, was that, well, citizens trust these politicians when on the basis of the manifesto or any kind of claim that the politicians are willing to actually answer back to the citizens' claim, right? That's the primary reason why the citizens are actually claiming and actively participating to actually represent their own self. They're the ones who actually claim there is a problem, right? For example, ethnic problem or gender problem, as my honorable partner have represented with its poverty here as a whole. Like also caught illustrating that citizens are the best actor to know, because in terms of this consumption tax, that like every kind of like economic activity that each individuals are taking accompanied with these some kind of like harms, right? We believe that citizens should be the best actor to decide. So when taking this proposal, we believe this is going to detriment to democracy, because now, like, the citizens are going to lose the way to trust these politicians in any kind of basis, right? Because the politicians, by taking their part, are going to do any sorts of things which they think is absolutely necessary, even though the majority of the citizens are not consenting to the fact that this itself is going to benefit them as a best, Mr. Speaker. And thereby, this is going to lead to my second criterion, whether people will be satisfied or not. Now, the justification coming from the government side is that because this is urgent, but we've given you like trillions of like alternatives, right? We've talked about how like they can sell national bond, or they can actually cut down the aggregate number of the public servant as a whole, or we can decrease the amount of the salary of this public servant. These sorts of things can be done but before thinking like increasing the consumption tax, right? We believe there's still much more room for this government to actually sweep make it clean, to actually to stabilize and get this like satisfactory amount of the budget, since this is a stagnating economy, right? So whether these consumption tax are going to work or not, right? The assumption of the government side is that it's going to work. That's it, right? But we talked about how, like, in this stagnated economy, the propensity to consume of each individual is actually been decreased. That means every time that you increase the amount of the taxation, we believe there's going to be less amount of the payment, which means there's less amount of revenue coming to the government, right? And thereby, we believe, like, in the first place, it is going to fail. But even if this is going to work, people are going to lose incentive to actually actively participate. And even if it fails, people also are going to lose active like participation to the politics in terms of the voting. Because now people are going to think, we cannot trust these politicians. We cannot trust anyone which are actually moving these politics as a whole, Mr. Speaker. We believe the concept of democracy is going to be detrimented by taking this proposal, and thereby we are very much right to oppose. Thank you.
Speaker, the sweeping generalization coming from their side is that every single time a government mandates a policy, all of the citizens are going to not believe in democracy anymore, right? We have proven to you how consumption is absolutely necessary, and these people will absolutely benefit from this policy, right? We think in these cases, in the same way as Fukushima excavation benefited them, they're going to still believe in democracy, and that is why this is going to work and it is necessary. I'm going to have three criteria to sum up this debate. First of all, the necessity. Second of all, about the justification. And third of all, will this work? Let me answer these one by one. First of all, about the necessity. Opposition tells us there's no necessity, right? Because we have bond rating companies and they give us a AAA, right? The lesson we learned from Greece, as I have told you from the very beginning, that we can't trust these people, right? Because in Greece, they suddenly degraded, and because they had budgets, they were not able to recover, right? We say that we don't want budgets. It is always bad to have budgets, and we do not want Japan to fall into situations like Italy or Greece, right? We believe that governments can only be trusted by bond companies only when they're actively making policies and engaging in debt problems in their country, right? We told you there's a necessity because citizens can't understand these problems thoroughly, right? It's different from parental right because when you're a parent, you see your child at first hand, right? You are never exposed to the type of information such as budget, or you are never having sufficient education about budget, and we think that especially because they are short-sighted, they do not have the capacity to calculate these things in a long term, right? But still, these people, all of them, are going to go through the harm if consumption tax is not taken. Second of all, about the justification. They tell us that number one, Fukushima was a consensus of the citizens, right? But I was never asked about Fukushima, right? There was never an election about should we have these people out, right? From a very constructive whip speech, Kogi tells us that Fukushima was a shared value, right? It was never a shared value. People living in Fukushima, they wanted to go back, right? But we had an opportunity, we had an obligation to take them out of that because they were never able to calculate it, right? We told you that there's a clear distinction between gay marriage or immigration, these controversial issues where not every single person benefits from, right? We told you that when it comes to consumption tax or social welfare, every single person has a chance to get sick. Every single person needs education and everybody needs childcare, right? Every single person is going to go through these harms if the budget goes low and the government is never going to, does not have the capacity to provide these protection of human rights. That is why there's a justification, and uniquely in this case. Third of all, will this work? They tell us no. Because people aren't going to believe in democracy anymore, right? As I told you in the very beginning, they assume that every single time a politician mandates a policy, citizens are not going to go to voting, they're not going to go to elections anymore, right? We have told you how this is not true, because even if these people mandate them, they're going to benefit them, right? Even after people were forced to move out of Fukushima, they still go to elections because there were clear benefits of not getting sick, right? They're going to trust these governments continuously. That is why democracy is not going to fail, right? We told you clearly how consumption tax raising is going to work, right? Because the type of items we are talking about are daily commodities that is absolutely necessary. We're talking about food, we're talking about clothes, and even if the price raises, because they need to live, because they need to eat every day, they're going to be willing to pay because they have to pay. And that is why we will absolutely have a revenue, right? They never engaged into this point, right? Second of all, Say told us that luxury, the tobacco industry is shrunk, right? But everybody knows I buy it, they buy it, and even if luxury, people continuously buy this, right? We think every single person, especially in Japan, they're going to continuously buy these things, and that is why it is absolutely going to work. That is why there are no harms, and they have never been able to prove any of the harms, right? Because people are going to believe in democracy, discrimination laws are going to be passed continuously, and therefore we are very proud to propose them.